$4 million in a bank account that his wife of 43 years did not know existed, in a name that his 3 adult children had never heard spoken inside their home not once in their entire lives, left entirely and completely and deliberately to a woman nobody in his family had ever met. And the most extraordinary thing about all of it is not the money. It is not the secret. It is not even the woman who received it. The most extraordinary thing about what Walter Gaines did is that by the time you understand the full shape of it, by the time you have followed this story all the way to its end, you will not be entirely certain that he was wrong. You will not be entirely certain that what he did was a betrayal. You might find yourself sitting with something far more uncomfortable than anger. You might find yourself sitting with understanding. And understanding in a story like this one is the hardest thing of all to carry. Walter Gaines died on a Wednesday morning in March at the age of 71. By Friday, his family thought they understood everything about the man they had buried. By the following Monday, they understood that they had never known him at all. Not completely. Not in the way that 52 years of marriage and 3 children and Sunday dinners and ordinary Tuesday evenings are supposed to guarantee. The man they buried was not a lie, but he was not the complete truth either, and the distance between those two things is the entire story. Before we go any further, let us know in the comments where you are watching from. We would love to hear from you, and please do not forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming stories on Dopamine Tales. To understand what Walter Gaines did, you have to understand who Walter Gaines was. Not who he appeared to be, who he actually was in the deepest and most specific sense of the word. Because the man who quietly accumulated $4 million over 31 years and left every single dollar of it to a woman his family had never heard of was not a complicated man in the way that people who do complicated things are usually complicated. He was not driven by ego or by greed or by the specific restlessness that drives certain people to build secret lives, parallel to the ordinary ones they inhabit. He was driven by something much simpler and much harder to argue with. He was driven by guilt that had been living inside him for 31 years, and by love that had been living inside him for even longer, and by a specific vision of what he wanted to exist in the world. After he was gone, that he had been quietly and methodically building toward since the year. His youngest child was 4 years old. Walter Gaines was a man with a plan, not a selfish plan, not a deceptive plan in the sense that deception usually means. A plan born out of the specific night that changed him completely, and that he had decided in the quiet, absolute way that certain people make their most important decisions was his to carry alone until the carrying was finally finished. He grew up in a working-class household in a mid-sized American southern city, the son of a postal worker and a seamstress who had between them more love than money, and who had made the specific choice that millions of working-class American parents make, which is to give their children everything available, even when everything available is not very much. His father read to him every night until Walter was old enough to read to himself, and then read beside him until Walter was old enough to stay up later than his father could manage. His mother sewed his Halloween costumes by hand every year because store-bought costumes cost money that could be redirected toward things that mattered more than costumes. Walter grew up understanding that the people who loved him most had always given him more than they had. That understanding became the operating principle of his entire adult life. He became a teacher because teaching was the specific form of giving that matched the shape of who he was. He was good at it in the way that certain teachers are good at it, not just competently but transformatively, in the way that makes students remember specific things a specific teacher said in a specific classroom 30 years later and feel the truth of those things landing again in their adult bodies with the same force they landed with the first time. He taught history. He had chosen history specifically and deliberately because he believed that understanding where things came from was the only reliable way of understanding where things were going and that a person who did not know history was a person who was perpetually surprised by the present. He taught it the way his father had read to him, not as a series of facts to be memorized, but as a series of human decisions made by human beings who had the same fears and the same hopes and the same capacity for both extraordinary generosity and extraordinary failure that his students had sitting in their desks in front of him every day. He wanted them to see themselves in history. He wanted them to understand that they were not spectators of the human story, but participants in it, whether they chose to be or not. That the decisions they made in their ordinary lives were continuous with the decisions that had shaped everything that came before them. Some of his students understood this while they were in his class. Most of them understood it years later. A few of them never forgot it. He met Dorothy at 19 at a church social on a Saturday evening in September and asked her to dance before he knew her name because something in the way she was standing at the edge of the room, watching the dancing with the specific expression of someone who wanted to be in the middle of it, but was waiting for a reason, caught his attention and would not let it go. She said yes before she knew his name because something in the way he walked toward her with complete and uncomplicated intention told her that this was a person who knew what he wanted and was not going to pretend otherwise. 52 years later, she would say at his funeral that she still did not fully understand how a yes on a Saturday night in September had become a whole life, but that she was grateful for every single day of it without exception, including the days that were hard and the days that were confusing, and the days after the lawyer's office that were harder and more confusing than any day that had come before them. Dorothy was a nurse. She spent her entire career in the emergency department of a hospital in the same city where Walter taught, and she had seen enough of human fragility and human resilience to understand that most people were doing the best they could with what they had, and that judgment was a luxury that emergency departments could not afford. She brought that quality home with her. It was part of what had made their marriage work for 52 years. Not the absence of conflict, but the presence of a woman who believed that understanding was more useful than condemnation, and who had spent enough time in rooms where lives were decided in minutes to know that the difference between the life you planned and the life you actually lived was usually a single moment that arrived without warning and reorganized everything. Walter proposed to Dorothy 7 months after the church social. He did not have a ring yet because the ring would have to wait until he had saved enough for the one he wanted to give her, and he was not willing to give her a lesser version of the thing simply because the timing was imperfect. He proposed with a letter instead, a handwritten letter that Dorothy kept in a wooden box on her bedside table for 52 years, and that her daughter Linda found after Walter died and read alone in her childhood bedroom and could not finish, because somewhere in the third paragraph she started crying in the specific way that people cry when they discover that the love they witnessed between their parents was even larger and more deliberate than they had understood while they were growing up inside it. The letter said things that Walter would have been embarrassed to say out loud, but was not embarrassed to write, because writing for Walter was the place where the full truth of what he felt could exist without the self-consciousness that speaking it always introduced. Dorothy had known this about him from the beginning. It was one of the things she had loved most. He was a man who expressed himself more completely on paper than in conversation, and she had learned early in their marriage to read both versions of him and to understand that the written Walter and the spoken Walter were the same person with the same feelings, just differently accessed. They were married on a Saturday in June in the church where Dorothy had grown up attending services every Sunday morning. It was not a large wedding. Walter's side of the church held his parents, 2 brothers, and a collection of cousins and friends who had known him since childhood. Dorothy's side held her parents, her 3 sisters, and the specific warm density of a family that had been gathering in that church for 3 generations and knew how to fill a space with love without making it feel crowded. The reception was in the church hall. Dorothy's mother made the cake. Walter's father made a toast that lasted 4 minutes and contained one joke that landed perfectly and one observation about love that Dorothy's mother wrote down on a paper napkin and kept for the rest of her life. Walter and Dorothy danced to a song that had been playing on the radio the first time Walter drove Dorothy home from a date and that he had memorized. The title of specifically because he knew he was going to want it at his wedding. That level of forethought was entirely characteristic. Walter Gaines did not leave important things to chance. He thought about what he wanted, and then he made arrangements for it. He had been doing that his entire life. The $4 million was simply the largest and most consequential example of a quality that had always been present in him, and that the people who loved him had always known was there without understanding all of the ways it was operating. They bought a house in the second year of their marriage in a neighborhood. The streets were shaded by old trees, and the neighbors left things on each other's porches without being asked, and where Walter knew the names of every family within a 4-block radius within 6 months of moving in, because he had introduced himself to each of them individually and asked them questions about their lives and remembered the answers. They built their life there brick by careful brick, the way certain people build lives, without drama and without announcement, through the accumulated ordinary days that turn into years before you notice the turning. Walter taught, Dorothy nursed. They paid their mortgage. They maintained the house. They had 3 children and raised them with the specific combination of high expectations and unconditional presence that produces adults who know both what they are capable of and that they are loved regardless of whether they achieve it. Marcus came first and was from the beginning the most intense of the 3 children, the one most likely to feel things fully and express them directly, and to have strong opinions about matters of fairness that he articulated loudly and without apology from the time he was old enough to articulate anything. Linda came second and was from the beginning the most organized, the child who kept lists and remembered details, and who at the age of 8 had a better understanding of the family schedule than either of her parents did. And James came last and was from the beginning the most like his father in temperament, quiet and observant and unhurried in his conclusions, but absolute in them once they arrived, the kind of child who sat with questions longer than other children, and who arrived at answers that surprised adults with their depth and their stillness. Walter coached the school debate team for 11 years. He organized the neighborhood block party every summer for 23 years and always remembered the dietary restrictions of every family on the street. He drove Dorothy's mother to her medical appointments for the last 4 years of the older woman's life because Dorothy was working and Walter's schedule could accommodate it, and because he believed that the specific act of showing up for the people your spouse loves without being asked is one of the foundations of a lasting marriage. He was by every visible measure exactly who he appeared to be. And this is the thing that made what the lawyer told his family so impossible to immediately process. Because there was no red flag to look back at. There was no moment in 52 years that Dorothy could point to and say that was it. That was the thing I should have questioned. That was where the hidden version of him was visible, if only I had looked more carefully. There was no hidden version. There was only the whole version, which included something his family had not been permitted to see. And the distinction between those 2 things is the one that took his children the longest to make peace with. The account had been opened 31 years before Walter died at a bank in a different part of the city from the one where he and Dorothy kept their joint accounts. He had opened it with money he had saved before their marriage, money that had technically been his alone since before Dorothy existed in his life, and he had been redirecting a portion of his salary into it since the early years of their marriage through a mechanism that the direct deposit system made possible. and that Walter had arranged with a quiet deliberateness that reflected his understanding that what he was building was going to take decades, and that decades of small redirections would eventually produce something large enough to matter. He was right. 31 years of a teacher's redirected salary, plus the careful investments he had made with that money, and the proceeds of 2 small properties he had purchased and sold without mentioning them to anyone, had produced $4,037,000. Not because Walter Gaines was a financial genius, because Walter Gaines was patient and consistent and had decided on a purpose for every dollar he redirected and had never wavered from that purpose in 3 decades. The purpose was Catherine Marsh, and the reason for Catherine Marsh began on a night 31 years earlier that Walter had never described to another living soul except Catherine herself. He was 40 years old. Catherine was 32. They had been working together for approximately 8 months on a community initiative that Walter had helped establish through his school, a program designed to connect students who were falling through the cracks of the formal school system with the social services and community resources that the school system itself could not provide. Catherine was the social worker assigned to the program. She was the person who understood the system well enough to navigate it, and who had enough genuine care for the children inside that system to feel personally the weight of every case that the system failed to catch. She and Walter had developed a working relationship built on mutual respect and a shared frustration with the specific way that institutions designed to help people tended to help people only up to the edges of what the institution could conveniently provide and no further. They had talked about this frustration many times over the 8 months of their collaboration, in the way that people who share a purpose and a location and a daily working reality talk about the things that trouble them most. Walter respected Catherine in the way that he respected people who did hard work without seeking recognition for doing it. Catherine respected Walter in the way that she respected people who used the access their position gave them to reach further than their position, required them to reach. And then there was the night that Walter had never described, the night that began with a phone call to Catherine at 7 in the evening about a 12-year-old boy named in the program's files only as D, a designation the program used to protect the identities of its most vulnerable participants. D had been in the program for 4 months. Walter knew him from a classroom visit he had made to D's middle school, part of the program's outreach efforts. D was the kind of child who was easy to overlook and impossible to forget once you had actually seen him, small for his age, quiet in the specific way of children who have learned that drawing attention to themselves is usually more costly than disappearing into the background, but with eyes that tracked everything happening in a room, with an alertness that communicated that whatever was going on inside his mind was considerably more sophisticated than the expression on his face suggested. Walter had noticed him on that classroom visit and had flagged him to Catherine as someone the program should make a deliberate effort to reach. Catherine had been trying to reach him for the 4 months since she had made progress. Dee had begun to trust her in the small, incremental way that children who have learned not to trust begin to trust when someone consistently shows up, and consistently means what they say, and consistently does not disappear. She had been building something with him, and on that evening the building collapsed. The phone call was from Dee's school counselor. Dee had not come home after school. His grandmother, who was his primary caregiver, was not reachable. The school counselor was calling Catherine because Catherine was the social worker assigned to case, and because the school counselor had a specific fear about Dee's situation that she did not want to articulate directly, but that was present in the quality of her voice and in the things she was not saying as clearly as in the things she was. Walter had been at Catherine's office when the call came because they had been working late on a grant application that needed to be submitted the following morning. He heard Catherine's inside of the phone call. He saw her face change while she was listening. He was already reaching for his car keys before she had finished the call. They drove together to Dee's neighborhood. They found Dee's grandmother. The evening went in the direction that both of them had been afraid it was going in. And by 11 o'clock that night, sitting in Catherine's car in the parking lot of an institutional building that both of them wished they never had to see again, Walter Gaines made a decision. He did not announce it. He did not share it with Catherine that night. He drove home. He sat in his kitchen for 2 hours after Dorothy had gone to sleep. And then he opened a notebook and he wrote a number at the top of a blank page. And he wrote Catherine's name beneath it. And he wrote the word foundation beneath that. And he closed the notebook and he put it in the back of the drawer in his desk in his study, and he went to bed. And he never closed the notebook again in the sense of walking away from what was in it. For 31 years, he came back to that notebook and he updated the number, and the number kept growing, and the name stayed the same, and the word foundation stayed the same, and Walter Gaines kept teaching history and coaching debate and maintaining the garden and driving Dorothy's mother to her appointments and dancing with Dorothy at anniversaries and at weddings and at graduations, and showing up fully and completely and with everything he had for the life he had built, and continuing quietly and without announcement and without ever letting the carrying of it show, to build toward the thing he had decided needed to exist. Catherine knew about the intention for the last 11 years of Walter's life. She had known Walter was carrying something from that night, but she had been carrying something from that night herself, and she had never asked him directly because she understood intuitively that the asking would require the answering, and that neither of them was ready to have that conversation until the time came when they were both ready, and the time had to be chosen carefully. The time came on a Tuesday afternoon when Walter called her out of the blue and asked if he could come to her office that afternoon. He was 60 years old. She was 52. They had stayed in contact through the years in the specific way of people who shared an experience that neither of them could talk about with anyone else. Occasional lunches, Christmas cards, a phone call every few months that covered ordinary topics in a way that both of them understood. He came to her office that Tuesday, and he sat in the chair across from her desk, and he told her about the notebook. He told her about the number. He told her about the plan. She told him she could not accept it. He told her she did not have a choice because he was going to put it in his will, and he would be dead before she could argue with him about it. She cried. He had expected that. He had brought a box of tissues, because he knew Catherine well enough to know that she was not a woman who cried, often or easily, and that the occasion of her crying was significant and deserved to be prepared for. She told him it was too much. He told her it was exactly enough. She asked him what Dorothy knew. He told her Dorothy did not know, and he told her why Dorothy did not know, and Catherine sat with his reasoning for a long time in silence before she said that she understood his reasoning and disagreed with it and was not going to argue about it because she understood him well enough to know that the decision had already been made. He nodded. She wiped her eyes. They talked for 3 more hours about the foundation, what it would do, who it would serve, how the money would be structured and administered and deployed. Walter had thought about all of this already. He had specific ideas, detailed ideas, the kind that come from 31 years of a history teacher's mind, applying itself to a problem it has never been able to put down. By the time Walter left Catherine's office that afternoon, they had the outline of something real, something that would outlast both of them if it was done correctly. Walter drove home. He had dinner with Dorothy. He helped James with a project James was working on in the garage. He went to bed at his usual time. He was, to every outward appearance, exactly who he had always been. He was also, beneath that appearance, something that only Catherine now fully understood. He was a man who had been building something for 31 years and who had just, for the first time since the night it started, allowed someone else to see the full shape of what he had been building. It had taken 60 years and 11 minutes of tears and 3 hours of conversation. Walter Gaines did not rush the important things. The lawyer Gerald Hutchins had practiced estate law for 30 years and believed he had encountered most of the human situations that appeared in the context of end-of-life planning. He had managed estates that contained surprises, secret children, forgotten properties, old debts, estrangements that nobody outside the family knew about. He believed he had seen enough that very little could fully surprise him. Walter Gaines surprised him, not the money. Gerald had managed larger estates, not the secrecy. Gerald had managed more complicated concealments. What surprised Gerald was the specificity of Walter's instructions and the quality of Walter's certainty. When Gerald had asked Walter, 7 years before Walter died, whether he wanted to include any explanation for his family in the legal documents, Walter had sat across from Gerald's desk for a full minute without speaking. Gerald had learned not to fill silences that belonged to clients who were thinking. He waited. Walter said, "Catherine will explain it. She will know what to say and when to say it." Gerald wrote that down, not because it was legally relevant, but because in 30 years of estate law, he had never had a client say that about the recipient of a bequest. Most clients who left significant assets to someone their family did not know, were either defensive about it or evasive about it, or occasionally defiant about it. Walter was none of those things. He was simply certain. The certainty of a man who had thought about a decision from every possible angle for 3 decades and had arrived at a place of complete peace with it. Gerald found that peace more affecting than anything he had encountered in 30 years of managing the complicated endings of human lives. The reading of the will was on a Monday morning, 11 days after Walter died. Dorothy sat in the center chair with Marcus on her left and Linda on her right and James at the end of the row. They were all still in the specific suspended state of the first weeks of acute grief, where the world continues at its regular pace, and you are moving through it but not entirely present in it, where ordinary things like traffic lights and coffee temperatures and the specific quality of morning light feel both heightened and unreal simultaneously. Gerald read the standard sections of the will. The house to Dorothy, the contents of the joint accounts to be distributed in the manner that Walter and Dorothy had agreed upon years earlier. Small, specific bequests to each of the children and grandchildren. A bequest to the school where Walter had taught for 38 years for the purpose of funding the debate team he had coached for 11 of those years. These were expected. These fit. These were the shape of the man they knew arranged into legal language. And then Gerald said the name Catherine Marsh and the number $4,037,000 in a single sentence, and the room changed in the way that rooms change when a fact arrives that is too large for the space it has been placed in. Dorothy did not make a sound. She had a specific quality of stillness that she deployed in moments of significant impact that was neither shock nor composure, but something between them, the stillness of a woman who has spent decades in emergency rooms and who knows that the first response to a crisis is to stop moving and assess before acting. She assessed. She sat in the stillness for long enough that Gerald began to wonder whether he should say something further. And then she asked the question that was not the question most people would have asked first. She did not ask, "Who is Catherine Marsh?" She did not ask why. She asked, "Did he take anything from our life to build this?" Gerald told her the truth, which was that he had not. That the seed money had existed before their marriage. That every subsequent contribution had come from a portion of his salary that had been redirected before it entered their joint account. That their house was fully theirs. That their retirement accounts were fully intact. That their life, the one they had built together, had never been diminished by a single dollar to fund this other thing. Dorothy sat with that for a long moment. Then she said something that Gerald would describe for the rest of his career as the most remarkable response to a will reading he had ever witnessed. She said, "Then he planned this before he knew what our life would be. He was building this before he knew what he was building it for. Gerald confirmed that this appeared to be correct. Dorothy nodded once. She did not say anything else in that meeting. She did not cry in that meeting. She saved the crying for later, for the private hours that belong to a person and are nobody else's business, for the nights in the house that was now fully hers and fully quiet in a way it had never been during the 52 years of Walter's presence in it. Marcus was angry in the specific way that the most direct member of a family is always the first to be angry. He wanted to know how a man kept $4 million secret from his wife for 31 years while living an ordinary life in an ordinary house on an ordinary street and presenting to his family every single day the face of a man with nothing hidden. He wanted to know what kind of man did that. He wanted to know what the money was for and who Catherine Marsh was that had made his father decide she deserved a fortune that he had spent 31 years building in secret while his children grew up believing they were a family without secrets. The questions were not unreasonable. The anger was not unreasonable. If anything, the reasonableness of the anger was part of what made it so difficult to argue with. A man who teaches high school for 38 years and drives the same car for 16 years and leaves $4 million to a woman his family has never met has done something that demands accountability. Marcus knew it and said it, and was right to say it, and the rightness of it sat in the lawyer's office like a weight that nobody in the room could lift or put down. Linda sat beside her mother and held her mother's hand. She is a school principal now, and she has spent her entire career thinking about children who need more than the system can reliably provide, and she was sitting in a lawyer's office being told that her father had spent 31 years quietly building a resource for exactly those children, and she did not know whether to be proud of him or furious with him for not telling her, because both feelings were present simultaneously and with equal force, and she was not a woman who handled ambivalence easily. She preferred clarity. Her entire professional life was organized around the production of clarity from complicated situations. Her father had just handed her a situation that resisted every tool she had for producing clarity from it, and she thought about the specific quality of her father's silences over the years, the ones she had always attributed to introversion. And she began the process of understanding that some of those silences had been occupied by something she had not been permitted to see. That process would take her the better part of a year. She would not rush it. She was her father's daughter in that respect, at least. James said almost nothing in the lawyer's office. He sat with his hands folded in his lap, the way his father always sat, and he looked at the floor and he thought about a conversation he had with his father when he was 12 years old. He had asked his father a question. He had asked whether there were things a person was allowed to keep just for themselves, even when they loved someone. His father had looked at him for a long moment with the specific quality of attention that James had always found both comforting and slightly unnerving, the feeling being seen completely by someone who was not going to share everything they saw. Then his father had said, "There are things you carry for other people that are not yours to put down." James had not understood that answer at 12. He had carried it without understanding it for 32 years, the way you carry something when you know it means more than you can currently access. Sitting in the lawyer's office at 44 years old, he felt the full meaning of it land in his body for the first time. His father had not been speaking philosophically, he had been speaking specifically. He had been answering James's 12-year-old question with his own 40-year-old truth. And the fact that he had done that he had told James something true without telling him everything, that he had offered a real piece of himself in the specific form that was available to him at that moment without going further than that moment allowed, was the detail that James would return to more than any other in the months that followed. Not the money, not Catherine, not the foundation. The conversation on a Tuesday evening when he was 12 years old and his father was 40, and the answer had meant something James did not yet have. the life experience to understand. Catherine Marsh called Dorothy 3 days after the reading of the will. She did not wait to be contacted. She understood that waiting would have been a form of cowardice that she was not willing to practice in this situation. She called on a Tuesday evening at 7 o'clock, which was the time she and Walter had agreed upon years earlier as the time she would call when the time came, because Walter had known Dorothy's schedule well enough to know that 7 on a Tuesday evening was the time Dorothy was most likely to be alone and settled and capable of the kind of conversation they were going to need to have. Walter had thought about all of this. He had planned for even this. Catherine dialed the number that Walter had given her 11 years earlier when he had made her memorize it, and Dorothy answered on the second ring. Catherine said her name. There was a pause. Then Dorothy said she knew who Catherine was. Another pause. Then Catherine said, "I know you have questions and I owe you every answer. I would like to come to you if you will allow it." Dorothy was quiet for long enough that Catherine understood she was not going to be rushed. Then Dorothy said yes, not because she was ready. She was not ready. She said yes because she had been married to Walter Gaines for 52 years, and she had learned in those 52 years that the things that were hardest to face were almost always the things that most needed facing, and that the only way through them was through them and not around them. She had never been a woman who went around. Catherine drove to Dorothy's house on a Thursday afternoon 2 weeks after Walter's funeral. She parked on the street in front of the house that Walter had described to her over the years in the way that people describe the places they love most, specifically, and with the kind of detail that comes from looking at something every day for a long time. The oak tree in the front yard that Walter had planted when Marcus was 3, and that was now wider than Walter could reach around. The blue of the shutters that Dorothy had chosen in the 3rd year of their marriage and repainted to the same color every decade since. Catherine sat in her car for a few minutes before she went to the door, not because she was afraid exactly, but because she understood the weight of what she was about to ask Dorothy Gaines to carry, and she wanted to go into it with the full presence that it deserved. She rang the bell. Dorothy answered. They looked at each other for a moment in the doorway. Dorothy stepped back. She said, "Come in." The two women sat down in the living room of the house he had lived in for 50 years, and Catherine told Dorothy everything. She started at the beginning, not at the night. She started earlier than the night, because the night could not be understood without the context that preceded it. And Catherine had learned from 3 decades of social work that people needed a foundation before they could hold the structure, and that the structure in this case was going to require a very solid foundation. She told Dorothy about the program and how it worked and what it was trying to do and why it mattered and why Walter had cared about it enough to invest his time in it beyond what his job required. She told Dorothy about the children the program served and what their lives looked like and what the gaps in the system meant for those lives in practical terms. She told Dorothy about working alongside Walter for 8 months and about the specific quality of his attention to the children in the program and about the conversation they had had about the frustrations of doing work that always felt like it was reaching the edges of what was possible but never quite crossing them into what was needed. Dorothy listened to all of this in the way she had always listened to things that mattered completely, without interruption, with the full quality of her attention directed at the person in front of her. She had been doing that for 52 years with Walter. She knew how to listen to the things that came before the thing. Then Catherine told her about the night. She told her about the phone call from the school counselor. She told her about the 12-year-old boy with the alert eyes and the small build who had been working with Catherine for 4 months and who had been beginning to trust her in the incremental way that children who have been hurt by the world's unreliability begin to trust when they encounter something reliable. She told Dorothy what had happened that evening, and she did not soften it because Dorothy was not a woman who needed things. Softened, and because what had happened deserved to be said in its full weight rather than in a diminished form that would have been easier to say, would have left Dorothy with a picture smaller than the truth. Dorothy's face did not change while Catherine spoke, not because it was not affecting her, because Dorothy Gaines had spent decades in an emergency room and she had trained herself to hold the weight of terrible things without allowing that weight to interrupt the reception of information that needed to be fully received before any response was possible. She held it. She listened to all of it. When Catherine finished, Dorothy sat quietly for a moment. Then she said, "He never told me, not once in 31 years. Catherine said, "No." Dorothy said, "I would have wanted to know." Catherine said, "I know. I told him that," she said. "What did he say?" Catherine said, "He said it was his to carry." Dorothy closed her eyes for a moment. Then she opened them. She said, "That is the most Walter thing he has ever done." Her voice was steady when she said it. It would not stay steady for long, but it was steady when she said it. And Catherine understood that the steadiness was real and not performed, and that it was the steadiness of a woman who has known someone for 52 years and who is recognizing them fully and painfully and with love in the worst thing they ever did. The foundation was established 14 months after Walter died. Dorothy was not just aware of it, she was involved in it. She had insisted on that involvement with the specific quiet force that had always been her primary mode of insistence. She had sat in Catherine's office with a legal pad and a pen and a list of questions that she had written over the preceding weeks, and she had asked every single one of them, and she had not moved on from any of them until she had an answer she found satisfactory. She had opinions about the foundation's structure and its priorities and its governance. Some of those opinions aligned with the plans that Walter and Catherine had discussed over 11 years. Some of them were different and better. Catherine had the grace and the honesty to acknowledge when they were better and to incorporate them. Dorothy had the grace and the honesty to acknowledge that Catherine understood the system, that the foundation was designed to work within better than she did, and to defer to that understanding where it applied. By the end of the process of establishing the foundation, they had built something together that was more complete than what either of them would have built alone. Walter would have found this outcome entirely characteristic of both women and would have been deeply unsurprised by it, and probably would have found it something close to perfect. Dorothy said something like this to Catherine once, about a year after they began working together. She said, "He knew we would do this. He knew we would end up in the same room, working on the same thing." Catherine said she thought that was probably true. Dorothy said, "I am still angry with him for not telling me." Catherine said she thought that was also probably true and also probably fair. Dorothy said, "Yes, both of those things can be true at the same time." Catherine said she had been a social worker for 30 years and had learned early that most important things contained at least two true things that appeared to contradict each other, and that the work of a life was learning to hold both without collapsing either one. Dorothy looked at her for a moment, then she said, "I think Walter knew that about you. I think that is part of why he chose you." Catherine did not say anything to that. She did not need to. Marcus took the longest of the three children to arrive at any kind of peace with what his father had done, and the peace he arrived at was not the uncomplicated kind, and he has never pretended it was. He is a contractor. He builds things. He has spent his entire working life in the specific physical reality of foundations and structures, and the relationship between what something is built on and how long it stands. He spent the better part of a year being angry at his father in the way that people are angry at the dead, fully and uselessly, and without the possibility of the confrontation that would have made the anger productive. On a Tuesday evening, 4 months after Walter died, and sat outside in his truck for 40 minutes without going in because he could not figure out what he would say when he got there. He went to see Catherine eventually. He had resisted it for 8 months, and then he had stopped resisting it because the resistance was costing him more than the visit would. He went to her office on a Tuesday afternoon with the specific, reluctant determination of a man who has decided to do something hard and has committed to not making it harder than it needs to be. They talked for 3 hours. At the end of 3 hours, Marcus asked the question he had actually wanted to ask since the lawyer's office. The question was not about the money and not about the secret and not about whether his father had been right or wrong to do what he had done. The question was, did he know how much we loved him? Catherine looked at Marcus for a long time before she answered. Then she said, the whole reason he never told you was because he loved you so much. He could not stand the thought of you carrying what he was carrying. He wanted your life with him to be clean. He wanted you to have all of him that was available to give and to not have the weight of what was not available to give. Marcus sat with that. He did not respond immediately because he was his father's son and the way that some things needed to be sat with before they could be spoken about. Then he said, that was his decision to make, not mine. Linda established a mentorship program at her school the year after Walter died. She has not made a public statement connecting the program to what she learned about her father. She does not need to. The people in her life who know both things understand the connection without needing it articulated. She is her father's daughter in the way that certain things do not require explanation because the explanation is visible in the action. She thinks about her father every time a child in her school falls through a crack that the system was not designed to catch. And she thinks about the word foundation and what it means to spend 31 years building one before you place a single thing on top of it. She has told her husband that she does not know whether to admire her father or be angry with him, and that she suspects the answer is both, and that she has made her peace with the both of it, because peace with complexity is the only kind of peace available in this situation, and she would rather have that kind of peace than the simpler kind that comes from reducing something to a single feeling that does not contain all the truth. James has said the least publicly of all 3 children. Privately, he is the one who has thought about it the most continuously and with the most attention to the specific texture of the experience. He has said to his wife that he thinks about the conversation with his father when he was 12 years old more than he thinks about anything else related to this whole situation. The conversation where his father said, there are things you carry for other people that are not yours to put down. James has said that he thinks about what it means that his father gave him that answer at 40 years old while sitting across the dinner table from a 12-year-old boy who had no idea what he was actually being told. That his father was answering the question honestly and specifically and personally, and that James had been carrying the truth of that answer for 32 years without knowing what the truth was pointing at. He has said that there is something in that specific detail, in the fact of a father finding a way to tell his son something real even when he could not tell him everything, that he finds both devastating and, in a way he cannot fully articulate, comforting. The connection was there even when the full picture was not. The love was real even when the disclosure was incomplete. James is quiet about it the way his father was quiet about the things that mattered most to him. The Walter Gaines Foundation has been operating for 3 years now. It funds emergency intervention resources for at-risk children in the city where Walter taught for 38 years. The kind of resources that were unavailable on the night 31 years ago that changed him. It has served 412 children in its first 3 years of operation. Catherine runs it. Dorothy is on the board. Marcus built the facility that houses the foundation's offices at cost, refusing to charge more than materials because he said his father had already paid for the building and he was not going to charge for it twice. Linda sends 2 students from her school to the foundation's after-school program every semester. James donated the proceeds of a property he sold last year to the foundation's endowment fund and did not announce the donation and would not have been known for it. if Catherine had not mentioned it at the Foundation's annual dinner. When the Foundation held its first anniversary event, Catherine spoke about Walter and about what he had built, and why he had built it, and what it had taken from him to build it, and what she believed it said about the man he was. Dorothy sat in the front row and listened to Catherine describe her husband in the specific terms of someone who had known a different part of him than Dorothy had known, and she felt something that she has since described as the most complicated emotion of her life. Not grief exactly, not pride exactly, not anger. Something that contained all three and that did not have a name she could find in the ordinary vocabulary of human. Feeling. She has stopped looking for the name. She has decided that some things are too specific to the particular situation that generated them to fit inside the general vocabulary, and that the right response to that is not to force the fit, but to let the feeling be what it is without requiring it to be named. Walter would have agreed with that. Dorothy has thought about this often. She thinks it is possible that 52 years of living with Walter Gaines gave her, without her knowing it was happening, some of the specific qualities she needed to receive the truth of Walter Gaines after he was gone. That the 52 years were the preparation for the Thursday afternoon. That he had been in the specific way of people who love quietly and completely, and without always showing the full shape of the love, preparing her for this without her knowledge for their entire lives together. She does not know whether she believes that, or whether it is simply the story that grief tells to make itself more bearable. She has decided it does not matter. The story is true enough. Walter Gaines loved her. He carried something he did not share with her. Both of those things are true. The Foundation exists. The children it serves are real. The money that Walter built over 31 years while living an ordinary life in an ordinary house on an ordinary street is doing in the world what Walter wanted it to do. That is real. The rest is grief and love and the complicated human business of understanding someone after they are gone. Dorothy Gaines has been doing that business every day for 3 years. She expects she will be doing it for the rest of her life. She does not find that prospect bleak. She finds it, if she is honest, entirely consistent with 52 years of marriage to a man who was always giving her something to think about. The question this story leaves with you is not whether Walter Gaines was right. That question has no clean answer, and the members of his own family have not arrived at a clean answer, and they lived inside the specific consequences of his decision in a way that you and I never will. The question this story leaves with you is something smaller and more personal and more immediately applicable to the life you are actually living. It is this. Is there someone in your life whose silence you have been reading as distance when it might actually be the weight of something they decided to carry alone because they believed you deserved to be protected from it? Is there someone who loves you in a form that is not immediately recognizable as love because it looks from the outside like absence or withdrawal, or the specific untalkative quality of a person who has made a private decision about what they can and cannot share? His family is still learning all the angles. They probably always will be. I hope this story reached something in you that you were not expecting it to reach. I hope it made you think about the people in your life who carry things quietly. I hope it made you think about the things you carry yourself and whether you are carrying them alone when you do not have to be. Leave a comment below and tell me what you think Walter should have done. Tell me whether you think Dorothy had the right to know from the beginning. Tell me which member of the family you understood the most. Tell me where you are watching from, because this community is everywhere. If you are not yet subscribed to Dopamine Tales, this is the moment. Because the next story we are bringing you is one that stopped an entire room cold. A woman smiled at her own funeral. And when the people in that room found out why the silence that followed was the loudest thing any of them had ever experienced. That story is already on this channel, and if you have not watched it yet, go find it after this. And if you have already watched it, tell me in the comments which one hit you harder. This is Dopamine Tales. Feed your mind, feel every word, never stop thinking.